Everyone. This is the Google Analytics 4 upgrade before it's too late. Tried to make it a little urgent. We'll talk about a variety of things associated with that. So what are we going to go over today? Sort of intro who I am, hopefully get some information about who y'all are so that we can kind of tailor this a little bit. Google Analytics, what is it? Full disclosure, I was a history major coming up, so I'm really fascinated by kind of where things start to where they get to today. And I think that's actually relevant when we're talking about Google Analytics. Do a little bit of a side-by-side between Google Analytics 4 and Universal Analytics, which is Google Analytics 3, just so that we're kind of understanding some of the major differences, since it is a pretty big shift. And then since Google's been in the news a bit, we'll talk a little bit about GDPR and privacy concerns related to Google Analytics, because that's a little bit of a wrinkle. And then we'll talk through kind of the basic steps for implementing Google Analytics 4. And then hopefully have some time for any questions at the end. I can talk a lot about analytics, so if folks have a lot of questions, if we want to do like a BOF later, I'm totally up for that. All right, so who am I? I'm Stephen Pashby. I'm an account manager at Design Hammer. We're a full-service web strategy design and development firm in Durham, North Carolina. We work a lot in Drupal, as well as WordPress, and do some custom JavaScript work, custom PHP work, kind of a variety of things. Got over a decade of experience working in Google Analytics, and I oversee most of our analytics implementations for our clients. So who are you? Is anyone here on the kind of developer side of the room? All right, so we got some developers. How about marketing side of the room? Some marketers, yeah, figured. Business, the suits, got some suits. All right, designers, no designers. All right, well, fair enough. Oh, one, I guess. How about anyone in a freelance capacity? A few freelancers, cool. Agency, some agencies, and in-house. No in-house, all right. Oh, in-house, sort of. Fair enough. I mean, it's not an exclusive category, so whatever you want to be is cool. If everyone would give me kind of a show of fingers of your comfort level with Google Analytics and experience with Google Analytics, 1 being not a lot, and 5 being a pro, you're here to show me where I'm wrong. All right.
3 1/4.
Okay.
3 and a knuckle.
Depends on how recently they changed the dashboard.
Right. That's fair. That's fair. All right. So it sounds like mostly we're kind of in that 2 to 4 range. That's a great place to be.
With the 5, I mean, I know there's at least 1 5 here in the green shirt.
All right. So what we're going to cover, so just what is Google Analytics anyway? What are the differences between Universal Analytics, Google Analytics 3, and Google Analytics 4? And then what about privacy and GDPR and Google Analytics 4 specifically? And how and when to upgrade to Google Analytics 4. So, Google Analytics, what is it? Highest level, it is a free analytics service offered by Google. It's implemented in some way or another by adding some JavaScript to the pages of their website. Page loads, JavaScript runs, stuff is tracked. It's originally developed from Urchin on Demand, which was a turn of the last century analytics service, but very popular. The original Google service was released in 2005, and there were subsequent major releases in 2009, 2012, and 2020, which is Google Analytics 4. If you look at W3 Tech's, kind of seeing who all is using Google Analytics, of websites that their tool can identify, almost 86% of websites are using some form of Google Analytics. So it is huge. Now, it's a little bit of a caveat. So sometimes they can't identify stuff. It's closer to like mid-60s of all websites I think they analyzed, but still, it's the big player, right? And that kind of makes sense. I mean, it's free. It's pretty powerful. Pretty easy to implement. So Universal Analytics. Google Analytics 3. This has been the main version, kind of the go-to production-ready version. Almost all the stuff that you look at online about how to do things in Google Analytics talks about Universal Analytics. Initially released in October 2012, so it has been around for a while. At its top, kind of the highest level, it's still really a refinement of the base Urchin on-demand technology. So they've added, Universal Analytics added support for cross-platform tracking, app and website tracking, custom dimensions and metrics. So but it's really kind of an incremental improvement of the same basic model. So it still really keeps the kind of the base decade-old model of page views, hits, and browser cookie of tracking of users. Historic data is largely compatible with previous versions. So if you were using, the asynchronous property previously, it wasn't a big leap to go to Universal Analytics, right? It's kind of, again, same model, pretty easy to think about going forward. Google Analytics 4, going to be a bit of a different story. So initially released in October 2020, to the point where we were talking just at the beginning, a lot of folks said, hey, Google, this is not ready for prime time. It doesn't do a lot of the stuff that we expect to be able to do with Universal Analytics. So that's all great. It has an entirely new model for tracking and analysis, but the new model is incompatible with Universal Analytics or earlier models. So there's no method to transfer your historic data from Universal Analytics to Google Analytics 4. And you can't even make an exact one-to-one comparison between data between Universal Analytics and Google Analytics 4. It's just a different model. Tracks things differently, has different underlying assumptions. So we really are at kind of a crossroads point here where you're going to have to move, because in March, Google announced that Universal Analytics would no longer track new data after July 2023. So we've got about a year, a little less, until Universal Analytics becomes basically just a place to review your historic data. And Google has only committed to support Universal Analytics data through December of 2023. So after that, maybe they'll extend it, but who knows? So, I think one of the things that I think is the most important thing to take away from this is if you're using Universal Analytics, now is the time to kind of get a different plan in place, whether it's Google Analytics 4 or another analytics package. You want to make that decision now, so when Universal Analytics goes away, you actually have historic data in whatever platform you're going to use going forward, so you can make good decisions. That's kind of big takeaway. Don't take away anything else. Make a plan like this month. So Google Analytics still has a lot of benefits, right? It's a free platform. It has a really robust feature set. And I think in many ways, it's the industry standard for small, medium-sized organizations. One of the interesting things was Google had Google Analytics 360. That was kind of their enterprise offering that you actually pay for. They actually rolled that into Google Analytics 4, so it's going away as well. So Google Analytics 4 is kind of, at least for now, the platform from Google. Basically, since almost everyone uses it, you can find so much information about how to use it, how to do different things, different patterns that you should follow, lots of different stuff. So big advantage for using Google Analytics from sort of community support. And then if you use other Google products, like Google Tag Manager, Google Ads, Google Search Console, Google Data Studio, YouTube, it has a really robust integration with many, many Google products. So if you're in the Google ecosystem, great. Google makes it easier to stay there. The concerns. Data privacy and ownership. My boss always says, if you're not the customer, you are the product. So, there is no fee for Google Analytics. So Google is getting something out of you using their very robust platform. They definitely, a lot of man hours have been poured into this platform. A lot of resources are poured into this platform, so they are getting some benefit. And then another big concern is if GDPR is relevant to you or your clients, there are some big considerations there. We'll talk about that in a little more detail. So let's talk about Google Analytics 4 versus Universal Analytics. So at a high level, Universal Analytics has kind of a core model of page views, and then uses the Google Analytics cookie, as well as some third-party cookies, and can be extended with custom events. If you want to track, it can track app usage, but you have to have a separate property for that between apps and websites. It comes with approximately 80 predefined reports, though a lot of those are more deprecated or no longer provide useful information due to changes to Google. They just haven't taken the reports out. And it has 4 types of predefined goals that you can use for conversion tracking. Google Analytics 4 is 100% event-based, has a lot more flexibility than Universal Analytics. It allows you to collect app and website data in a single property using multiple data streams. Multiple websites can go to a single property. It's got kind of a secret sauce, but ostensibly better ability to track users across devices. It's kind of neat, if a little creepy. But has kind of a small number of predefined reports, like less than 20. And the real big focus from a reporting perspective is not giving you, 80, or maybe it's in closer to 100 reports these days in Universal Analytics that you have to kind of sort through, but rather giving you a pretty easy custom reporting interface that you can kind of customize your reports to your own particular needs. And goals are identified as specific event conversions, which is sort of important. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So I want to, yeah.
Are there default events that would replace like the classic visit?
Yeah. So there are, and we'll talk a little bit in detail. But yes, there are default events. Frankly, the event loadout by default in Google Analytics 4 is pretty useful. If you're using custom events for a lot of stuff in Universal Analytics, you're not going to have to do a lot of that by default because a bunch of the things that I always set up for my clients are like, yeah, that just comes out of the box. So we'll talk a little bit in more detail on kind of that model and sort of kind of the key metrics I associate with Universal Analytics versus Google Analytics 4. We'll talk in more detail about events, and then we'll talk in a bit more detail about conversions, because I think those are like mental model things, the most important things to talk about. So the core model in Universal Analytics is, again, page views, Google Analytics cookie, and then third-party cookies for like referral information, ad retargeting, stuff like that. Session information is derived from hits, page views, and the Google Analytics cookie. So it figures out, okay, session started because we got a hit from this user first time, and then at some point this user stops interacting with the website, then our session is over and we have a time. Leverage third-party cookies for display advertising features, and you can definitely extend it with custom events, and those are really hits with a defined structure of additional metadata. Google Analytics 4, again, 100% event-based. There's a larger selection of user interactions tracked out of the box. So for example, one I always think of is Universal Analytics, by default, does not track file downloads. So if you have a bunch of PDFs on your site and you want to know which of those are being downloaded, well, you could go to your server logs, but that's kind of a pain. But that's a thing where you'd have to configure a custom event. And it's a little bit of a hacky custom event, honestly, because it is what you're doing is you're looking for clicks on links that have a file extension in the URL, right? So it's a bunch of steps. It's a little hacky. But out of the box, file downloads tracked by Google Analytics 4. Now, under the hood, they're probably doing the same thing, but at least you don't have to muck around with the particular regex to get the right file extensions and stuff like that. So it's kind of nice. So Google Analytics 4 is also moving towards cookieless tracking. So they're no longer using third-party cookies for anything associated with GA4. Still using a first-party cookie, but at least Google says the model will support cookieless tracking when that becomes a thing. So how does Google get all of the kind of data stew that Google wants? Well, machine learning and other secret sauce things. So again, maybe that's comforting, maybe it's not, but specifically third-party cookies are gone, and it looks like Google Analytics 4, when cookieless tracking is required, will be in a position to do that. Yeah.
Sorry, which party is which?
First party is Google Analytics. Third party is anyone else.
Okay.
So, I mean, your own first party website cookies are separate from this discussion. More event flexibility, because Google Analytics 4 had a very rigid, or Google Analytics had a very rigid event structure. Very free form for events. So you can kind of make them do what you need them to do rather than sort of fitting the data that you needed to capture into custom events in Universal Analytics. So again, like I said, history major. So a lot of it for me comes back to like, what are some of the key metrics and what does that tell us about the platform? So we look at key metrics in Universal Analytics. What are the big ones people talk about? I want a lower bounce rate. I want more page views. I want more pages per session, right? And like you look at all the reports are lined up to show you these particular metrics. This is core to the entire kind of worldview of Universal Analytics. So bounce rate, percentage of visitors to a particular website who navigate away from the site after viewing only one page. Well, that's bad, right? Maybe, right? If you have a resource, someone goes to the site from search, they find that resource immediately. Cool. Your site has succeeded. They don't need to search through the site for the resource because they found it, right? If you're a nonprofit, you're trying to give this particular resource away. Cool, you have succeeded, even though you have a 100% bounce rate on this page, right? Pages per session. Average number of pages a user views in a single session, right? Higher is better, right? Again, maybe. Maybe not though, right? Because if you have a very high number of page views per session, then you might have users who are confused or spending a lot of time looking through the site and can't find what they're looking for. Average session duration, same thing, right? Longer is not necessarily better. And it's tracked based off of, generally, by default, page views, right? So if I go to one page, right, but it's a very long page, I'm very interested in what's there. And I read that entire, 5,000 word article, but I don't click another page after that, my average session duration is going to be really low because there's not that extra page view to capture that time I spent on that page. Right? So again, maybe these are important. But if you think about where Universal Analytics came from, and you think about what the internet was like and how it was monetized when Urchin was out there and then the earlier versions, what are we trying to do? We're trying to get ad impressions for our website because we're trying to sell our ad space, right? And that's still the case for, news organizations and stuff like that, but it's not the case for a lot of other organizations. A lot of other organizations are not trying to sell ads on their website. So these metrics are not necessarily very relevant to a lot of other organizations. And a lot of times under Universal Analytics, folks would augment these with custom events that are, more relevant to that particular company or organization. But, I think it's helpful to remember all of these, they are old assumptions, right? They are really, tied to 20 years ago. And, just think how different, the world and the internet is today versus 20 years ago. It's huge, right? So key metrics in Google Analytics 4. And again, you'll see a huge shift here. Engaged sessions. So according to Google, an engaged session metric is count of sessions that lasted longer than 10 seconds or had a conversion event or had 2 or more screen or page views. So now we capture a lot more useful things, right? So someone has spent a little bit of time. Someone has looked at as like landed on the site and done a web form submission. Boom, done. Downloaded a file, done. That's an engaged session. And again, those would have been, depending on how your form was configured, a bounce under Universal Analytics without other tracking mixed in there. And 2 or more screen or page views, it does indicate engagement. Average engagement time per session. Google says this is the user engagement duration per session. So in other words, the amount of time a user is actively engaging with the page. Scrolling, also tracked out of the box by Google Analytics 4. So think of that long page, those scrolls, tracked. So we're seeing engagement there. And also, is the page in the primary window being viewed on the screen, right? That's another pretty huge thing, right? If it's just sitting over in a tab, not so useful. But if it's the primary window, well, they're probably engaged with it, right? Engagement rate. So the ratio of engaged sessions relative to total sessions. So that gives you more, probably a more relevant, more versatile way of looking at how engaged someone is with your website, as opposed to just a number of page views or whether they bounced. And if you think about it, since everything's an event and they have more flexible events, very likely, since events are more kind of front and center than in Universal Analytics, you'll end up using more events, right? And if you're using more events, then those are other events that are getting captured in these engagement stats. So again, it kind of, I think, in thinking of that as event-based, it's funneling everything towards events. So I think that's a pretty savvy way of changing things. If you're going to change something, I think this is much more flexible and probably useful. Events, let's talk about those just briefly. So in Universal Analytics, you could configure events. There are a bunch of different ways to do that. If you're using the Google Analytics module in Drupal, it has some events built out of the box. You can do others through the module. You could do it yourself in JavaScript. If you're using Google Tag Manager, very easy, straightforward workflow to configure your events with tags in Google Tag Manager. But events have a set structure: an event category, event action, event label, and event value. And then you can kind of slice and dice your data coming over. That's cool. But event value, what does that mean? Is my event, is this a 1? Is this a 2? It's a structure that you can use, but I find that particularly if you've been using sort of out-of-the-box Google Analytics, like the module for Drupal or a plugin for WordPress that adds custom events, they have some default configurations for like event category, event action that are kind of useless. And like they don't give you information. And if you've already got your historic data in that format, now, hey, if you want all of your data to be kind of in the same format so you can actually like review across different types of events, you've got to match that format. You actually lose some stuff. So, it looks nice. There's some useful things for it, but it can also kind of end up down a long road that isn't super useful. So events in Google Analytics 4 got a wide range of included and easily added events. File download, scroll, video start, video progress. And then you can configure additional custom events. And all of the parameters are flexible. So you can have events with 5 parameters, with 1 parameter. So it requires a little bit of thought, but you've got a lot more flexibility than you had under Universal Analytics. Additionally, Google provides a large library of recommended events, which are, effectively, here's a structure for this common web interaction that is in keeping with the other built-in events to, again, make it easier for you to keep things consistent, make your data useful between the built-in events and any sort of custom events you implement. Because, again, in Universal Analytics, we had our page views and stuff, and then over here we had our events. And they're not really the same. Whereas in Google Analytics 4, events, events, events. It's all an event. Page views are an event in Google Analytics 4. It's maybe a bit more work up front for something that is outside of the recipes Google provides for recommended events. But there are a pretty fair number of resources, and once you kind of get in that event space, it's pretty reasonable. So goals and conversions in Universal Analytics. So in Universal Analytics, each property, or each view technically, could have your own goals configured, which would allow you to track conversions. Did this website convert? And Universal Analytics supported 4 types of goals. Destination, which is this specific page loaded, and that allowed you also, with that specific type of goal, to establish a expected funnel path to get to that page. Duration, session lasted a certain amount of time or longer. Pages or screens per session, anyone that was more than 2 pages per session. Or event, a specific event triggered. Right? Those are the 4 things that were supported under Universal Analytics. And as you can see, 2 of those are, lining up with those kind of key metrics, right? Just almost one for one. And then another one has the assumption that you're going to go through a specific sales funnel, right? That's what that destination really is about, that kind of specific sales funnel. And we know that now we tend not to prefer as much of an on-rails experience as web users. So maybe that's a little bit of an old school way of looking at things too. Goals and conversions in Google Analytics 4. Conversions directly replace goals. So there's not a goal anymore, it's just conversions. Specific events can be marked as conversions. So this event, it's a conversion. On the other hand, there's no current mechanism for that sort of funnel tracking. So that is, I think, one of those places where people say, well, this isn't ready for prime time. I think it's one of those things that Google says, hey, this is a free tool. Too bad. We think this is better. So that's kind of an overview, Universal Analytics, Google Analytics 4. So let's talk privacy considerations. So GDPR, what is that? So it's a EU law that governs data protection and privacy. It's pretty complicated, but at the highest level, it protects the personal data, including name, location, IP address, cookie information, and much more, of EU citizens and EU businesses. It provides EU citizens a lot of rights related to this, which I was talking with some developers the other day. I was like, a lot of this stuff, it's great on paper. It doesn't actually think about how the internet works very well. So there's a little bit of friction there. If these rights were enumerated, 25 years ago, the internet would have been built in a different way. But it's not. So a little bit of friction. But basically, a lot of different rights: right to access, rectification, erasure, restriction of processing, portability, right to object, and then rights about automated decision-making and profiling of your specific data. Right? I mean, that's a lot, right? Just to think about that, like anyone in the EU should say, hey, I want you to just remove all of my data from your analytics. Like, how would you do that? Yeah, it's kind of neat. So, a little bit of can of worms. So GDPR applies to any organization operating in the EU, as well as those outside the EU that offer goods or services to users in the EU. Doesn't only require to the website, but also any services that the website uses that collect any user information, including Google Analytics. I'm not going to answer whether GDPR applies to you. Talk to your lawyer. All right, so universal analytics privacy protection. So there's a lot of privacy, at least from a website owner, in universal analytics. So personally identifiable information, like names and IP addresses, are not provided to website owners. And it's also a violation of terms of service if you were to pass that to universal analytics via custom events or some other mechanism. However, universal analytics does track or does collect IP addresses and data from third-party cookies used to measure the effectiveness of advertising and improve the effectiveness of Google products. And also this is stored on Google servers located in the US. In the first half of this year, France, Italy, Austria, and Denmark are the enforcement agencies related to GDPR for those countries, determined that universal analytics does not comply with GDPR. So websites that are subject to GDPR should cease using universal analytics. Again, consult your legal counsel if that's you or your clients. The core concern is there are insufficient protections to prevent the US government from spying on data on Google servers. Not political, it's just like that's what they say. Insufficient protections there. So the user is not able to consent with the US government to allow the US government to potentially, use a FISA warrant or whatever to get their info from a Google server. So since that can't happen, according to the enforcement agencies, universal analytics, right out. But as of last month, there have been no economic sanctions issued for the use of universal analytics. But, who knows? I mean, again, 86% of websites? Seems like there'd be a lot of enforcement opportunities there. Google Analytics 4 has several improvements for privacy. So while Google Analytics 4 uses IPs to determine where users' data is stored, data can be stored without IPs on EU servers, which would not be subject to, for example, the CIA knocking on the door of the data center and saying, hey, we need to see what's on that server. Also offers country-level controls and customizations, which allow you to kind of minimize the data that's collected based off IP. EU and the country-level enforcement agencies have not made official decisions regarding GA4. Many commentators, not surprisingly, who also sell competing analytics products, feel that GA4 does not meet GDPR compliance. So they're like, yeah, you gotta move to another platform, and hey, we sell one. In an attempt to address these concerns, the US and the EU actually have announced a new framework for transatlantic data flow with improved protection of data. So formal language hasn't been finalized. Who knows how long that's going to be? There's a lot of stuff going on in the world. And it's too early to determine whether the framework will be deemed adequate by the EU enforcement agencies or the EU privacy NGOs that like to sue in EU courts to say that this isn't adequate. So, more to come on that. But maybe GA4 will be fine. Maybe not. Don't know. So there are a few alternatives I'll just kind of put out there for you. I was just looking recently for a client who is subject to GDPR, and they wanted to look to move away from Google Analytics. And these were four that looked to have kind of similar Similarly robust custom event tracking capabilities. Though they are generally in the kind of older page view bounce rate model, which is a little bit of a bummer. They all generally have a monthly or yearly fee, but it's based on usage, and kind of turn that around. In this case, you are the customer, right? You are paying, you own your data, you can delete your data, and so you actually have more control over the data. So, and you know, for most small and medium-sized organizations, the cost is pretty reasonable. It's not crazy Google Analytics 360 money. The other kind of caveat is that stuff's not as full-featured. It doesn't integrate as tightly with Google Analytics, Google products. So, you know, a little bit less easy to use. You're probably going to need a developer to do some JavaScript for some of the platforms. All right, so implementing Google Analytics 4. And we'll go a little bit fast, but so should you implement Google Analytics 4? Because I haven't really told you whether you should or not. That depends. Are you currently using Universal Analytics? Well, at the very least, you need to get off of that as quickly as you can, or get something else in place in parallel so you build up some historic data in that other platform. Are you using other Google products? That's a vote for maybe going to Google Analytics 4. Is your organization subject to GDPR? Well, then you need to get off of Universal Analytics like very fast, and maybe you go to Google Analytics 4, roll the dice, or maybe you go to a different platform. When should you implement Google Analytics 4, if you're going to? Are you currently doing like regular reviews of Google Analytics or Universal Analytics? Does this review include historic data, right? If it does, then you need to implement Google Analytics 4 soon so that you build up historic data in Google Analytics 4 so at some point you can cut over. But right now you're not going to be able to do that. Do you have custom events implemented in current Universal Analytics property? Well, then you want to keep track of those and get those over into Google Analytics 4 so they're being tracked. Are you using Google Data Studio dashboards, consuming Universal Analytics? Can consume Google Analytics 4, but you're going to have to update all of your reports. Are you undertaking a significant website redesign in the next 3 to 6 months? It's good to actually do Google Analytics 4 beforehand. So again, you're establishing that benchmark data. Don't wait 6 months and then be at a place where you have to re-implement Universal Analytics to maintain current tracking, and then Google Analytics 4 to get past that. How should you implement Google Analytics 4? How is your Universal Analytics implemented, right? And then who is responsible for maintaining or updating your analytics? What's their technical comfort level? So, Google Analytics 4 implementation, 4 basic steps. Create a Google Analytics 4 property. Super easy. In Google Analytics, you either use the GA4 Setup Assistant in the admin view for your existing Universal Analytics property, or you hit the Create Property CTA, which will default to a Google Analytics 4 property. Enter the appropriate name, fill out the organizational details. Since the properties support multiple data sources, you'll have to set up a data source. It will guide you to that immediately following. You enter the, I'm going to assume web. You select web, your domain, and the display name for the stream. At that time, you can adjust the events that are provided automatically, but probably just want to leave that as a default because it's useful stuff. Once the stream's configured, you get a stream ID. It's g dot whatever, and you can access your tracking codes. Pretty easy. Filtering internal traffic, if that's a thing that you do currently, it's done a bit differently in GA4. Rather than have a separate filtered profile or a filtered view, right? You've got just a single view for Google Analytics 4. And so what they allow is basically creating filters that can be used as segments. So you basically set that up on the data stream level, set up your IP rules as you would, and then you can turn those on or off or set them to testing. Testing tracks the data, but allows you to segment it out in your reports. Turning the filter on does not capture the data. Turning the filter off captures the data without tagging it. And so it basically creates an automatic segment, which is pretty cool. So how do you add it to the website? So there are a few different ways, particularly in Drupal. You've got some good options. One, you could just copy and paste your site tag into the theme. That's easy. 2, you could use a Google Analytics module, which can be configured with the appropriate data stream ID. It supports GA4. One nice thing about the Google Analytics module is you can then set it to only fire that code for particular user roles or particular pages. So, don't have your admin users junking up your Google Analytics. You can also use Google Tag Manager. I think that's really nice because I do a lot of stuff in Tag Manager. You can either just drop the container into the theme or use the Google Tag Manager module for Drupal. Big takeaway is whichever one you do, make sure you account for only desired pages or user roles. Right? Again, you don't want to have a lot of admin page views junking up your data. Last step is configure events, reports, and conversions. So events will need to be implemented at somewhat level in JavaScript, either directly in code, via Google Tag Manager, which again, it's the same sort of very streamlined experience, you just use a different tag than the Universal Analytics tag, or via appropriate Drupal module, and they support it to the degree the module does. Reports can be configured either in GA4 or an alternative analysis platform. Google Data Studio is very popular. It's prettier. I would recommend either leaning into one or the other, not to focus on trying to do both. And then conversion events need to be implemented before they've been identified in GA4. So it's a matter of like, hey, this event, this is a conversion. There are 2 ways to do that. One is you configure the conversions, type in your conversion event name. Needs to be exact, case sensitive, all that stuff. Or you can go to the events under configure and toggle events to be conversions. So next steps. Once you're done, you're ready to track data in GA4. If you've implemented GA4 in parallel with Universal Analytics, I recommend thinking 3 to 6 months of letting the GA4 run before you start using that primarily as your analysis tool. But it depends on what your review cycle is. And once you've got that sufficient historical data in GA4, you can sunset Universal Analytics, hopefully before July 1, 2023. So, big improvement. If you want to move to use GA4, or if you want to use Google Analytics, you should move to GA4 ASAP. If you have GDPR requirements, stay tuned. Questions? Yeah.
So we have a lot of sites that use Google Analytics module, and recently everybody's been creating the GTAG IDs in that sister account with the UA.
Yeah.
So now you have both
Yeah.
in the module. I know it's going to sunset, but say you have somebody who's completely ignorant of analytics and everything else, and they come to the site and they're seeing both. What's going to happen to that UA if you just leave it there and you don't do anything?
So basically, the question is, for the recording, the GA module supports having both a UA and a GA, or a UA and a G tag in there. What's going to happen once UA goes away, Universal Analytics goes away, if you don't take it out, right?
Yeah.
So basically, July 1, 2023, UA properties are not going to track any more data. So there's probably some minor economy on load times to take that UA out, so you don't have the particular tracking code, the particular JavaScript associated with that UA being added to the pages. But it's not going to mess up any of the Google Analytics 4 data. Tracking codes are entirely separate. They're not going to cross-pollinate or anything like that. So it's not a big deal to leave it in there. But if you wanted to just dot all your I's and cross all your T's, after July 1, you'd take it out. Yeah.
Do you know how long the data will be available for like logging into the dashboard and looking at it on UA, like once that gets implemented?
So what Google has said is 6 months after they stop tracking, at least 6 months. So I think that will maybe depend on how quickly they see adoption, or maybe it won't. But so I'm planning not to have access to stuff past December of 2023.
So the data that's been collected for the last 15 years,
You can export it and then find your own tool to analyze it. I mean, again, it's I totally get you, but at the same time, it's like it's a free service, and we are ultimately the product, not the customer. Yeah.
You talked about events, and from a design perspective, say you're thinking about for a website to change the homepage layout, to go from something that was all above the fold, just what you see without scrolling at all, and maybe you want to build a site that is going to have a very long homepage that people are going to be required to scroll. Now, with these events, you would be able to say, track how much scrolling is done in that homepage by visits or by sessions.
You've got, so there's a scroll event that basically tracks depth on the homepage. And so you could basically set conversions for a particular depth and say, okay, if folks got down this far, we count that as a conversion.
Okay. And then for a similar sort of event, like if you have a photo gallery, let's say when you go left or right, or you're going through the gallery,
you'd have
a unique URL.
Yeah, you could totally set up, you'd have to basically set up an on-click event for the navigation. But, you could use like, whatever appropriate element or tag is in the HTML and just set that up in the event. Probably be easiest to do that in Google Tag Manager.
Okay.
Yeah, probably last question. Go ahead.
What version of the Google Analytics module is accounting for GA4? That's been built in for a while.
I believe that it has. Full disclosure, we don't tend to use that one. We tend to use Tag Manager, which has sort of a weird bug that I don't quite understand right now, so you have to apply a patch, it's the whole thing. But it's on the front page of the module, so it's front and center. I'm pretty sure, I know the 8 and 9 versions do. I think I saw 7 for GA module had that, but I think that's like maybe the last thing that's going to be done.
That release
Yeah.
a few weeks or recently.
All right. Well, like I said, we are now 3 minutes over time, but I hope you all got some good information. If folks want to do like a BOF later, I'm totally up for it. If not, I will just go to sessions, and that's cool with me too. Well, thank you all.
Thank you.